On August 30th, 1940, flying officer Ludwig Paskevitz did something that would change the course of World War II. He was supposed to be on a training flight, a gentle patrol to familiarize himself with British procedures before being allowed into real combat. His squadron, made up entirely of Polish pilots who had escaped the Nazi occupation of their homeland, had been kept out of the Battle of Britain despite their combat experience. The British didn't trust them. They thought the Poles were too reckless, too emotional, too eager for revenge. They were wrong. When Paskevitz spotted a German Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter during that training flight, he didn't radio for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He attacked. Within seconds, the Messerschmitt was spiraling toward the English countryside in flames. That single kill forced the RAF to admit what they'd been denying. These Polish pilots weren't just good, they were exceptional. The next day, 303 Squadron was declared operational. In the 42 days that followed, they would shoot down 126 German aircraft, more than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. They would produce the war's highest-scoring ace, a Czech pilot flying with 17 confirmed kills in just 4 weeks. And they would force Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of RAF Fighter Command, to write words that should have been unthinkable. Had it not been for the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same. This is the story of how a group of exiled pilots, dismissed, underestimated, and relegated to the lowest ranks, became the RAF's deadliest squadron and helped save Britain from Nazi invasion.
To understand why 303 Squadron fought with such ferocity, you have to understand what they'd already lost. On September 1, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, German forces invaded Poland from 3 directions simultaneously. It was the beginning of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new form of warfare that combined overwhelming air power with fast-moving armored columns. The Polish Air Force, flying mostly obsolete PZL P-11 fighters with fixed landing gear, was hopelessly outmatched by the Luftwaffe's modern Messerschmitt Bf-109s. But the Polish pilots fought anyway, and they fought brilliantly. Despite being outnumbered nearly 3-to-1 and flying aircraft that were a generation behind, Polish pilots scored confirmed kills against German bombers and fighters. They learned tactics in those desperate September days that would serve them well a year later over the skies of Britain. Then, on September 17th, came the betrayal. The Soviet Union, Hitler's ally under the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east. Poland was now being crushed between 2 totalitarian giants. The war was over in weeks, though Polish resistance never truly ended. For the pilots of what would become 303 Squadron, the fall of Poland was personal in ways the British would never fully understand. These weren't professional airmen going off to a foreign war. These were men whose families were now under Nazi occupation. Their wives, their children, their parents were living under a regime that viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for slave labor or extermination. The lucky ones managed to escape. Through a network of underground routes, Polish airmen made their way across Romania, through the Balkans, to France. By early 1940, over 8,000 Polish servicemen had reached French territory, including hundreds of trained pilots. France needed them, but the French military, trapped in the rigid thinking of World War I, didn't know what to do with experienced fighter pilots. Training was inadequate, conducted on obsolete equipment. Polish pilots were rarely deployed to combat units. When the German invasion of France began on May 10, 1940, only 174 Polish airmen, just 10% of available strength, were actually used in combat.
It was an unforgivable waste of talent. Despite this, the Polish pilots who did fight distinguished themselves, scoring 52 confirmed kills, 3 probables, and 6 damaged enemy aircraft. But France was falling, and falling fast. Within 6 weeks, it was over. For the second time in 9 months, the Polish pilots found themselves fleeing a German invasion. This time, they were headed for England, and they were not asking for permission to fight. They were demanding it.
When the first Polish pilots arrived in Britain in June and July 1940, they encountered something unexpected: skepticism bordering on hostility. The British didn't think they needed Polish help. Yes, the RAF was losing pilots at an alarming rate, but these foreign pilots, with their poor English, their strange uniforms, and their emotional intensity, seemed like more trouble than they were worth. The RAF brass worried about morale. Would defeated pilots from conquered nations have the will to fight? Language was a massive barrier. Most Polish pilots didn't speak a word of English. Communication between British and Polish officers had to be conducted in French, and even that was imperfect. How could you coordinate complex aerial maneuvers with pilots who couldn't understand radio calls? There were concerns about flying discipline. The Poles had trained in different tactics, on different aircraft. They didn't understand RAF procedures, formations, or protocols. British squadron leader Ronald Kellett would later recall that the Poles seemed overeager, individualistic, and dangerously aggressive. So the RAF made a decision that was both pragmatic and insulting. The Polish pilots would be accepted, but only as the lowest-ranking officers. Men who had been captains and majors in the Polish Air Force found themselves demoted to pilot officer, the most junior commissioned rank in the RAF. They were required to wear British uniforms, removing the insignia of their own nation. They had to swear allegiance to King George VI, a foreign monarch, in addition to their existing oaths to the Polish government in exile. And perhaps most galling, some British voices argued that the Poles should be required to repay the costs of their training and maintenance after the war, as if they were freeloaders rather than combat veterans volunteering to risk their lives for a country that wasn't even their own. The RAF's solution to the Polish problem was to create 2 segregated Polish squadrons, 302 and 303. They would be kept separate from British units, closely supervised, and brought into combat only when absolutely necessary. To hammer home how little the British trusted them, the RAF devised a humiliating training exercise. Polish pilots were ordered to ride tricycles around the airfield in flying formations, each tricycle equipped with radio, speedometer, and compass. Imagine combat veterans, men who had flown against the Luftwaffe over Poland and France, being made to peddle children's toys around a runway while British observers watched and smirked. It was meant to teach them formation flying. It was, in reality, a display of institutional contempt. But the Poles endured it because they understood something the British didn't yet grasp. Britain's situation was becoming desperate. By August 1940, the Luftwaffe was launching massive daily raids on British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. RAF Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Young British pilots were being rushed into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time against German veterans with hundreds of hours of experience. The average life expectancy of a new RAF pilot was measured in weeks. The Poles, by contrast, averaged over 500 hours of flight time each. They had fought in the Polish campaign, fought in France, and learned hard lessons about staying alive against superior numbers. They didn't need training. They needed hurricanes, fuel, and permission to kill Germans.
303 Squadron was declared fully operational on August 31, 1940. Within 24 hours, they were in combat. Their first major engagement came on September 2nd, and it was spectacular. The squadron intercepted a large formation of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters over the Thames estuary. When the shooting stopped, 303 Squadron claimed 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, a record for a single day's combat by any RAF squadron in the Battle of Britain. British ground controllers monitoring the battle were stunned. One group captain, skeptical of the claims, actually flew with the squadron on their next mission to verify. He came back shaken. Yes, they do in fact get what they say they get. The Polish tactics were simple and terrifying. Get close, very close, then fire. British pilots had been trained to open fire at 400 yards, a cautious distance that gave them time to break away if they missed. The Poles closed to 100 yards, sometimes 50 yards, near point-blank range by aerial combat standards. At that distance, you couldn't miss. But you also couldn't afford a mistake. One wrong move, and you'd collide with the enemy aircraft or fly through its explosion. As squadron leader Kellett observed, there was no shortage of determination, for the Poles had scores to settle and were impatient to set about doing it. The Poles fought differently because they thought differently. For British pilots, this was a defensive war. Protect the homeland, survive until America joins, wear down the Germans. For the Poles, this was personal vengeance. Every German bomber they shot down was one less bomb falling on Britain, yes, but it was also payback for Warsaw, for their occupied homeland, for families they hadn't heard from in months. The psychological dynamic was completely different. And the Germans noticed. Luftwaffe units began reporting encounters with a squadron they called the Raffle Squadron. Raffle being a play on RAF, combined with the Polish word for devil. German intelligence identified 303 Squadron as an unusually dangerous opponent and advised pilots to avoid engagement if possible. That was remarkable. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe still believed it was winning the Battle of Britain. They weren't supposed to be afraid of any RAF squadron, but they were afraid of the Poles. The kills mounted rapidly. September 5th, 9 German aircraft destroyed. September 6th, 8 destroyed. September 7th, 6 destroyed. September 9th, 11 destroyed. September 11th, 13 destroyed, including 2 by a Czech pilot named Josef Frantisek, who was emerging as something extraordinary, even in a squadron of exceptional pilots. Frantisek's story deserves its own telling. Born in Czechoslovakia in 1914, he had fled his country when the Nazis occupied it in 1939, joined the Polish Air Force, fought in the September Campaign, escaped to France, fought there, then made his way to England. He was, by temperament, a loner. Brilliant in the air, impossible on the ground, perpetually breaking rules and defying authority. His commanding officers quickly realized that Frantisek fought best when left alone. So they made an unusual arrangement. Frantisek would fly with 303 Squadron on patrols, but he wasn't bound by formation discipline. Once airborne, he was free to break away and hunt independently. Frantisek would climb to altitude, position himself along the route German aircraft would take returning to France, likely damaged, low on fuel, vulnerable, and wait like a hawk. Between September 2nd and September 30th, flying alone, Frantisek shot down 17 German aircraft, 9 Messerschmitt Bf Minnow 9 fighters, 6 Heinkel H-111 bombers, 1 Junkers Ju-88 bomber, and 1 Messerschmitt Bf-110. 17 confirmed kills in 28 days made him the highest-scoring ace of the entire Battle of Britain, British or foreign. He flew with a fury none of the others could match, one pilot recalled. Frantisek never made a damage claim. Every engagement ended with the enemy aircraft destroyed or Frantisek breaking off. On September 20th, General Ladislav Sikorski, Commander-in-Chief of Polish forces, visited 303 Squadron and personally awarded Frantisek the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military decoration. 6 days later, King George VI visited the squadron and presented RAF awards, including a Distinguished Flying Medal to Frantisek. For one shining September, the Czech loner flying with a Polish squadron under British command was the most celebrated fighter pilot in the world. And then, on October 8th, Frantisek's Hurricane crashed during a routine patrol near Ewell, Surrey. He was killed instantly, one day after his 26th birthday. The cause was never determined. Fatigue, mechanical failure, fuel shortage, no one knew. The pilot who had survived dozens of aerial combats died flying over peaceful English countryside. His loss was a blow to 303 Squadron, but by then the broader Battle of Britain was already turning. Hitler, frustrated by the Luftwaffe's inability to achieve air superiority, postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. The RAF had won, and 303 Squadron had been the sharp end of that victory.
When the official accounting was done, the statistics were extraordinary. 303 Squadron had flown 1,049 combat sorties during the Battle of Britain, engaging the enemy on 480 occasions. They claimed 126 German aircraft destroyed, the highest total of any RAF squadron, despite joining the battle 2 months after it began. Their kill-to-loss ratio was 14-1. For every Polish pilot killed, 14 German aircraft were shot down. That ratio was unmatched by any squadron on either side. Perhaps more remarkably, 303 Squadron achieved this with only 6 pilots killed and 15 Hurricanes destroyed in combat. Those numbers demand context. The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, saw the Luftwaffe lose 1,733 aircraft, almost 700 more than the Allies. About 650 more German planes were damaged. It was more than half the Luftwaffe's total operational strength, a crippling blow from which German air power never fully recovered. And in that critical moment, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Polish pilots accounted for over 200 enemy aircraft destroyed. This from just 145 Polish airmen flying in the battle. 79 in various RAF squadrons, 32 in 302 Squadron, and 34 in 303 Squadron. 29 Polish pilots died during the Battle of Britain. Their names are engraved on the Polish War Memorial near RAF Northolt, erected in 1948. Among them was Ludwik Paszkiewicz, the pilot who scored that unauthorized first kill on August 30th. He was shot down and killed on September 27th, less than a month into combat. He was 26 years old. Historians still debate whether the Polish contribution was decisive or merely significant. But Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the man who commanded RAF Fighter Command throughout the battle, left no room for ambiguity. In his official report, Dowding wrote, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." That sentence is worth unpacking. Dowding wasn't a sentimental man. He was a hard, pragmatic commander, nicknamed Stuffy by his pilots for his humorless demeanor. He had been one of the most vocal opponents of letting Polish pilots fly operationally, worried they'd be a liability. For him to write those words, "I hesitate to say the outcome would have been the same," was an extraordinary admission. He was saying, as clearly as military diplomacy allowed, that without the Poles, Britain might have lost. Winston Churchill, in his famous speech on August 20, 1940, spoke of the RAF pilots. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The few numbered about 3,000 pilots total. The Poles were a small percentage of that number, but a disproportionate percentage of the kills. They were the few among the few. And yet, after the battle was won, the Polish contribution was quietly downplayed. Why? Because of politics. The ugly truth was that Britain's alliance with Poland was always conditional and always cynical. Britain had gone to war in September 1939, ostensibly to defend Poland. When Germany invaded, Britain and France declared war on Germany in fulfillment of their treaty obligations. But they didn't actually help Poland. No British or French troops moved to aid the Poles. No bombers struck German positions. It was called the Phony War, a period of declarations without action. Poland fell alone. By 1945, when Nazi Germany was finally defeated, Poland's situation had become even more tragic. The Soviet Union, having been Germany's ally in 1939, had switched sides after Hitler invaded Russia in 1941. Now the Soviets were Britain's allies, and Stalin made it clear he intended to keep Poland under Soviet control. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, desperate to maintain the wartime alliance with Stalin, agreed.
At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Poland's fate was sealed. The country the Allies had supposedly gone to war to defend was handed to a totalitarian dictatorship. The Polish pilots of 303 Squadron, who had fought for 5 years believing they were fighting for Poland's freedom, discovered they had won the war but lost their country. When victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945, Polish servicemen were excluded from the London Victory Parade. British officials feared offending Stalin. It was a calculated humiliation. Newspapers noted the absence. George Orwell wrote, "The London Victory Parade included American, French, Dutch, Belgian, and other Allied troops, but not the Poles. They had fought from the first day to the last, and they were not invited to celebrate." Many Polish pilots chose not to return to Soviet-occupied Poland. If they went back, they faced arrest, show trials, or simply disappearing. Those who did return were often imprisoned as Western spies or fascist sympathizers. Their service in the RAF was treated as evidence of disloyalty to the communist regime. 303 Squadron was officially disbanded in December 1946, though a reconstituted version existed in exile. The original pilots scattered. Some settled in Britain, working ordinary jobs, rarely speaking of their wartime service. Others emigrated to America, Canada, Australia. Their uniforms went into closets. Their medals were packed away. The squadron that had saved Britain became a footnote, mentioned briefly in official histories, but largely forgotten by the British public. The Polish pilots had fought for a free Poland, but Poland wasn't free. They had fought alongside Britain, but Britain had betrayed them. And they had fought with a courage that demanded recognition. But the Cold War made acknowledging Polish heroism politically inconvenient. It would take decades for the truth to be fully told.
For 40 years, the story of 303 Squadron existed primarily in Polish émigré communities and in military archives. The British public largely forgot. But in the late 1960s, as archives from World War II were gradually declassified, military historians began to reassess the Battle of Britain. They discovered what official British accounts had downplayed, that Polish pilots had been disproportionately effective, that their contribution had been decisive at critical moments, and that they had been treated shamefully both during and after the war. In 1980, on the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, surviving members of 303 Squadron were finally invited to official British commemorations. It was a small gesture, but for men now in their 60s and 70s, it meant something. One surviving pilot, Ludwig Martel, said, "We didn't fight for recognition. We fought because it was necessary. But it's good, finally, to be remembered correctly." The Polish War Memorial at RAF Northolt, erected in 1948, became a site of annual pilgrimage. Every September, on the anniversary of the Battle of Britain, veterans would gather, fewer each year as age took its toll, to remember the dead and the cause they'd fought for. In 2002, the British government finally issued an official apology for excluding Polish forces from the 1945 Victory Parade. Prime Minister Tony Blair called it a grave injustice and said the Polish contribution to Allied victory deserved to be properly honored and remembered. In 2015, a monument to Polish airmen was unveiled in London near Westminster. Prince William attended the ceremony. The inscription reads, "This monument honors the role played by Polish airmen in the Battle of Britain and throughout the Second World War." The surviving veterans, now in their 90s, attended. One of them, 96-year-old Jan Zumbach's son, Zumbach himself having died in 1986, said, "My father fought not for monuments, but because his homeland had been stolen. If these memorials mean young people learn that truth, then they have purpose." Popular culture has slowly caught up. The 1969 film Battle of Britain included Polish pilots, but gave them minimal screen time. The 2018 Polish film Hurricane, also released in Britain as Mission of Honor, focused specifically on 303 Squadron and Josef Frantisek. While Hollywood has never made a major film about the Poles, unlike, say, the American volunteers in Eagle Squadron, British and Polish documentaries have thoroughly covered the story. Books proliferated in the 1990s and 2000s. 303 Squadron, the legendary Battle of Britain fighter squadron by Arkady Fiedler, became essential reading. Robert Grettender's Poles in Defense of Britain provided comprehensive day-by-day chronicling. These weren't just military histories, they were acts of historical justice. The squadron's legacy matters beyond the historical record. It's a story about refugees, immigrants, and what they can contribute when given the chance. The Polish pilots were unwanted foreigners, dismissed as emotional and unreliable, relegated to the lowest ranks. Then they became the best squadron in the RAF. That has contemporary resonance in an era of migration debates and nationalist politics. It's also a story about fighting for something larger than yourself. The Polish pilots knew they were probably never going home. They knew Poland would not be free even if Germany was defeated, but they fought anyway, because the cause, stopping Nazi conquest of Europe, was bigger than their personal losses. As Witold Orbanovich, commander of 303 Squadron, said years later, "We fought for our families, yes, but also for an idea that small nations have the right to exist, that tyranny must be opposed, that courage matters. We lost Poland, but we didn't lose those ideas."
By the 21st century, almost all the pilots of 303 Squadron had passed away. The last surviving member of the original squadron, Squadron leader Ludwig Martel, died in 2008 at the age of 96. With his death, the living link to that desperate summer of 1940 was broken. But their descendants carry on the memory. The 303 Squadron Association, based in London, organizes annual commemorations and maintains an archive of photographs, letters, and oral histories. Schools in Britain and Poland teach the squadron's story as part of World War II curriculum. And in Poland itself, despite decades of communist suppression, 303 Squadron's exploits are now celebrated as a source of national pride. In 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a group of Polish internet activists named their project Squad 303. They send anti-war messages to individual Russians, hack Russian propaganda sites, and provide digital support to Ukrainian defense efforts. They chose the name deliberately, just as their grandfathers fought a totalitarian invader in 1940, they would fight one in 2022. The spirit of the squadron endures. RAF Northolt, where 303 Squadron was based, still exists as a military airfield, though it's now primarily used for VIP transport and special operations. The squadron's memorial stands on the base, visited by thousands each year. The control tower, where pilots received their scramble orders, has been preserved as a museum. You can stand in the same room where, on September 15, 1940, the climactic day of the Battle of Britain, controllers vectored 303 Squadron toward a massive German raid on London. You can see the same maps, the same plotting tables, the same telephone lines. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the voice crackling over the radio. 303 Squadron, scramble, bandits incoming, Vector 270, Angels 20. The Hawker Hurricane fighters that 303 Squadron flew are now museum pieces. Only a dozen or so airworthy Hurricanes still exist worldwide. But in 2021, one of those restored Hurricanes was repainted in 303 Squadron markings and flew in the Royal International Air Tattoo, Britain's largest air show. As it roared overhead, an elderly Polish-British man in the crowd, the grandson of one of the original pilots, wept openly. "He never talked about it," the man said later. "I grew up not knowing what my grandfather had done. Only after he died did I find his medals in a box in the attic. That plane, with those markings, it's not just history, it's my family." That's what makes the 303 Squadron story powerful. It's not abstract history.
It's about real men who made real choices at a real moment when everything hung in the balance. They chose courage when caution would have been justified. They chose to fight for a country not their own when their own country had been abandoned. They chose honor when cynicism would have been understandable. And in choosing those things, they changed history.
What made 303 Squadron so devastatingly effective wasn't just courage, it was superior tactics developed through hard experience. The Polish pilots had advantages that British training simply couldn't provide. First, combat experience. While many RAF pilots in 1940 had fewer than 50 hours of flight time and no combat experience whatsoever, the average Polish pilot in 303 Squadron had over 500 hours of flight time and had fought in 2 campaigns. They'd been shot at, they'd seen friends die. They knew what combat looked like, sounded like, felt like. That psychological preparation was invaluable. Second, their tactics emphasized 3 principles that British training undervalued: situational awareness, aggressive closing distance, and concentrated firepower. British pilots were trained to maintain formation discipline, stay with their wingman, and open fire at 400 yards. Polish pilots learned to scan the sky constantly, break formation when necessary, close to point-blank range, and fire in short, controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while ensuring kills. Squadron leader Kellett, watching them in action, noted they had extraordinary spatial awareness. They seemed to know instinctively where every aircraft was, friend and enemy, even in the chaos of a dogfight, and they were utterly fearless about getting close. Third, gunnery skills. The Hawker Hurricane was armed with 8 .303 caliber machine guns, formidable firepower if properly employed. But .303 rounds were relatively light. You needed multiple hits to bring down a bomber with armored crew compartments. The Poles understood this. They aimed for engines, fuel tanks, cockpits. They didn't spray ammunition wildly. They waited until the target filled their gun sight, then fired precise 2-second bursts that conserved ammunition while ensuring kills. British combat film analysis showed that Polish pilots achieved a hit ratio nearly double that of average RAF pilots. Fourth, unit cohesion. 303 Squadron wasn't just a collection of individual pilots. They were a brotherhood forged in shared trauma. They'd survived the fall of 2 countries together. They trusted each other absolutely. That trust translated into tactical flexibility. British squadrons sometimes struggled to coordinate because pilots didn't fully trust each other's abilities. Polish pilots knew what their wingman would do in any situation because they'd trained together, fought together, fled together. Finally, motivation. This cannot be overstated. British pilots were defending their homeland, which is powerful motivation. But they were also defending a homeland that still existed, that they'd return to after each sortie, where their families were safe. Polish pilots were defending a Britain that had become their only sanctuary. They were fighting for a Poland that no longer existed. Every German plane they shot down was vengeance, was meaning, was purpose in a world where they'd lost everything else. As one pilot put it, the British fought to protect their country. We fought because we had no country left to protect, so we protected theirs.
The story of 303 Squadron is, ultimately, a story about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. It's about 34 Polish pilots who lost their country, watched their families disappear under occupation, were treated as second class by their British allies, and then became the most effective fighter squadron in the most important air battle of World War II. It's about a Czech pilot who flew alone, shot down 17 enemy aircraft in 4 weeks, and died the day after his 26th birthday in a crash no one ever explained. It's about a military establishment that didn't want to give foreigners a chance, then had to admit those foreigners saved them. It's about refugees proving themselves through valor when the nation hosting them doubted their worth. And it's about the bitter irony that the men who helped save Britain from tyranny couldn't save their own country from a different tyranny, and Britain didn't help them do it. When Winston Churchill said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," he was talking about all RAF pilots. But within the few, there were even fewer, the 145 Polish pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain, 29 of whom died doing it. Air Chief Marshal Dowding's assessment was blunt and honest. Without the Polish squadrons, he hesitated to say the outcome would have been the same. That's as close as a British military commander could come to saying, "They saved us." Today, 303 Squadron exists in memory and in warning. Memory. These men deserve to be remembered not as footnotes, but as heroes who fought for a free world even when their own freedom was gone. Warning. The story reminds us that refugees aren't burdens. They're often the people who've lost everything and understand most clearly what's worth fighting for. The Polish pilots of 303 Squadron asked only for planes, fuel, and permission to fight the Germans. Britain gave them that, eventually. In return, they helped win the Battle of Britain. Not a bad exchange. In September each year, on Battle of Britain Sunday, a small ceremony takes place at the Polish War Memorial near RAF Northolt. Wreaths are laid. The Polish and British national anthems are played. A hurricane, if one can be arranged, flies overhead in salute. Fewer people attend each year. The war is now 80 years past. Soon even the children of the pilots will be gone. But the inscription on the memorial endures. They came from a country in bondage, yet they were the ones who saved the free. That paradox, men from an enslaved nation liberating a free one, is what makes 303 Squadron's story immortal. They were, in the fullest sense, heroes, imperfect men who did extraordinary things when history demanded it. Britain owed them everything. Britain gave them almost nothing. But they fought anyway. And we are all, whether we know it or not, living in a world they helped create.